Welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about how things have gotten so much better, and yet somehow things have gotten so much worse. And so, again, this is really just kind of the subject of why mental health needs to be discussed and needs to be understood and reviewed and reflected and constantly. I mean, to me, if you look at the concept of mental health and the solutions that we can develop, to me, it's the same concept as finding a cure for a virus. Is that the cure this year is going to change to next year, and so forth and so forth. And again, a lot of times it might be a slight tweak or this or that, but that's to me one of the biggest mistakes that the people of the world keep making is they keep thinking that somehow we've got it right this time. We've failed. I'm not saying we've failed, but we've come up short. We've been wrong so many times. You'd think that we'd find the pattern that we know some stuff, but we're never going to get to the point where we know for a fact this is how things work. This is the solution. This is it. Yep, for sure. Doesn't happen. And again, so I'd say the same thing with mental health. Is you look at the concept of mental health and what affects us and how it affects us, and it's constantly going to change because the world around us is changing, and therefore how events in life is going to change how it affects us. Because why I'm saying things have gotten so much better and yet they're so much worse. As you look at the past, as far as the standard of living, you think the standard of humanity, you just think about a few thousand years ago, it was very normal for most people to line up and just start lopping at each other with swords and spears and stuff. And again, you didn't see, I mean, granted, I'm sure people had fears of death and so forth. But I mean, if you thought about that today, if you had people line up in a row and start just butchering each other, just start chopping each other into pieces, every single person in that event would need just serious mental adjusting. They would need a team of therapists to get them to come back from what that would do to the human mind. Again, you just look at back in the French Revolution and so forth. They had public decapitations where they brought all the nobles out and they chopped their heads off in front of everyone, including children. And again, none of these people needed therapy to deal with that kind of a traumatic witnessing. And then nowadays, you look at the events taking place, and again, I'm not diminishing or belittling what we're going through. I'm just identifying that in the past, everyone would have witnessed horrendous events like this, and nowadays that is extremely, it's absurd. First, I mean, when you think about when Columbine happened, everyone was just, their jaws hit the floor and was like, "What?" And again, too, you just think of all the horrific things that happen, that we'll read headlines from throughout the world. But again, especially here in the United States, just the general standard of living is so much better than it ever has been. And yet you look at the mental health and see it diminishing rapidly. And you have to ask, well, why? What's going on? How are we going through less traumatic events per capita? And yet we're somehow doing worse. I mean, even if you look at the concept of just like I say, the advancements of this country. If you look at the standard of humanity, when this country was founded in for the first couple hundred years, it was very much I say very 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 sad. It was the level of humanity was nowhere near where it should have been, and yet you see our mental health, especially in you could say the last 30 years, has just rapidly declined. Again, the world, generally speaking, back in the 80s and 90s in the United States, at least where I grew up in the Seattle area, it was pretty freaking chill. I mean, not to say that there weren't bad things happening and tragedies, but generally speaking, it just kind of seemed like really wasn't that bad. And so that's one of the things that I think needs to be discussed, is why, when the actual events taking place in our lives, when those tragedies aren't increasing, they're becoming less and less commonplace. We have, you think about the advancements we have in medicine and so forth. And again, you just say, well, why are we all, I don't say why are we all suffering from mental health and mental unhappiness? And to me, I think the reason why is because of the access that we have, with tragedy, with the fact that, again, like I said, that our humanity has increased dramatically, to where, again, we just think of how we view human life now and how we viewed human life a couple hundred years ago, and it's dramatically improved. And so that is a big reason why, is because the fact that there's still, people out there that have the mentality of the Middle Ages, that have the mentality of just butchering people and not caring, and that's just a part of the sad case of humans. But the fact is that most of us don't live that way, and we've evolved. And again, too, you just look at tragedy. You just look at an accident, where somebody isn't even meaning something maliciously. And again, it's very difficult for us to accept it. And so it's important to identify why we have an issue, accepting these pains and these realities. And it's the fact that we have advanced so much to where they're not commonplace, to where, it was, again, you just look at the average lifespan, back in the Wild West, and I think it was like 40 years old or something like that. And so, again, when you expect death around every corner, you just accept it as a part of life. But when death is so avoidable in this country, and we've removed things that in the past would have just been immediate death sentences, again, it's just one of those things where that does actually, removing the possibility for tragedy actually does have a huge impact on mental health. And it's because our minds aren't as accepting to death and accepting to tragedy as they were in the past. In the past, it was just very commonplace. As I was talking in the movie about being a Gold Star family member in World War II, it was 11% of the population had an immediate family member, so a sibling or a child or a parent that died in World War II. You go to extended family members, and the vast majority of this country was related to somebody or knew somebody personally that died in World War II. And so you had a country going through that pain together. And as horrific as the war was, because that's the thing, is you look at, just the standard issue, the standard experiences of fighting in World War II. And it's horrific. I know Air Force, if you were part of an Air Force bomber crew, you had to do a handful of missions. I'm not sure how many the number was, but essentially, if you made it to that number, if you made successfully through that many missions, you were sent home. The reason being is that every single time you flew off, you had a 50% chance of not coming home. And so again, these are the horrific things, horrific realities that the past had to experience, and yet their mental health was so much more stabler than our own. And it's because it ironically is because, I think, because we were going through it together, because everyone just knew that reality, knew how fragile life was, and it was something that obviously it affected them. But again, too, it's just, I think that is kind of the irony of the world we're living in this country, is that we have things so good that when they go awry, we're just shell shocked. We don't know how to cope with it. We don't understand it. And the really tough thing about that is that because it's so rare, is one, like I'm saying, we individually aren't ready for it, and two, the likelihood of somebody being around us who understands it is pretty minuscule. It's, like I said, as time goes on, death sentences or what were seen as death sentences are becoming less and less frequent. You just think about how, when AIDS first came out, again, that was just it was a ticking clock. And nowadays, I'm pretty sure that the medicine to combat it is fairly affordable and so forth. And so, again, these are just things where, as we're removing death's presence in our lives, or the frequency of it in our society, we're becoming less and less. We don't. It's almost like we don't acknowledge it. We don't. It's the point where, and again, I don't think that we should stop, trying to progress to diminish every unnecessary death. If we can stop every death in the country and in the world, that would be fantastic. Unfortunately, that's not going to be able to happen. But again, that's something we should simply strive for, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it is important that as we're affecting the reality around us, as we're affecting the components that make up our mental health, that we understand the impact it's going to have, or at least we're actively looking for how it is going to affect us. Because again, I don't think that's something that we've done as a whole. I think that, I'm not 100% sure when they started talking about mental health per se, but again, I remember growing up in the 80s and 90s, and I don't, again, if someone talked about mental health back then, I probably would have thought padded cells and straitjackets. I would have thought, that movie with Jack Nicholson, The One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I would have thought of some sort of extreme version of that. But I wouldn't have understood and necessarily even accepted that everyday people, that everyone around us is dealing with some type of mental health imbalance, and that it's something that we need to be aware of, and that we need to strive to try to combat, that we strive to heal, and that we all have impacts on ourselves, and we all have this situation where we need to be aware of our pain. We also need to be aware of the pain of people around us, and so we can help them. But so as I was discussing, you look at the differences that we have in our lives. Again, too, even just as the self testimonies and so forth come forward with Black Lives Matter and other causes, where so much of this pain that we're discussing, and so much of the pain that we're seeing, if you watch I want to say true crime on TV and so forth, where you just think of the horrific things that family members have gone through, where parents were the ones who were the source of immense pain. And back when I was a kid, growing up in the 80s and 90s, none of these things were talked about. None of these things were, I didn't know anything about those. I didn't know that everyone had, or I assumed everyone had, a general stable parent household and so forth, that they didn't go through all these horrific things. But the more and more we're discussing our pain, and the more and more we're self-reflecting, and the more people are opening up about the pain they're going through, I think that has its effect on people's mental health in general. Even if you haven't gone through something, finding out a loved one's been through something horrific like that, it's got to have its own impact. Finding out even a complete stranger had to go through something so horrific, it's going to have an impact. And so again, you see, a perfect example was that girl who, she was in, I want to say Spokane, Washington, who was white, who portrayed herself as being black, and was the, I think, president chapter of the NAACP in Spokane area. Again, you see the empathy that she was driving, and again, that to me would be driven by mental health, and the fact that she was so appalled at what these black communities had gone through, that she portrayed herself as being one of them, as piloting their cause. And so again, I think it's very easy to look at things and just kind of shake them off and just say people are absurd. But I think that there's a lot of reasons behind people making these extreme actions and these extreme statements, even if we don't understand them, and even if they're not on point per se. Again, I think that the number one root of all this imbalance in our country is mental health. And again, it starts with trying to identify every little aspect of it and understand it. And I think that that's one of the big things that we need to reflect on, is how things could have gotten so much better from our past. We've improved so much with so many different civil rights and so forth, and yet from a mindset, from a mentality, it feels like things have gotten significantly worse. And rather than us just say that it shouldn't be that way, or they were worse back then, so we should be fine, we need to really look at why people are having a harder time, and people are finding life more mentally defeating today than they did so many years ago. Because, with which, again, we're just removing it and saying that, well, we shouldn't be that way. It didn't stop the process. It didn't stop the pain. It didn't stop the source of why this is happening. And again, if we don't reflect on it, we don't identify these things, it's just going to get worse. But yes, as always, good luck and good night.